The Katyusha rocket launcher, Stalin's organ. July 14, 1941. German forces are deep in Soviet territory, crushing Red Army defenses. The Wehrmacht seems unstoppable. Soviet commanders are desperate for any weapon that might slow the German advance. At the Orsha railway station in Belarus, a new Soviet unit deploys a weapon that Germans have never seen. 7 trucks, each carrying a rack of rockets. At 15:15, they fire. In 10 seconds, 112 rockets streak toward German positions. The explosions are devastating. An entire German infantry regiment is shattered. German survivors report seeing a fiery rain and describe the sound as the scream of the damned. Before the Germans can respond, the trucks are gone, racing away at high speed. The weapon was the BM-13 Katyusha, a truck-mounted multiple rocket launcher. The German soldiers called it Stalin's organ because the rocket launcher rails resembled organ pipes, and the sound of incoming rockets resembled terrible, discordant music. The Soviets called it Katyusha, Little Katy, a term of endearment from a popular wartime song. By any name, it became one of World War II's most feared weapons and one of the war's best-kept secrets until its combat debut. This is the story of the Katyusha, a weapon born from desperation that became a symbol of Soviet military power. It's a story of innovative thinking applied to existing technology, creating a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It's about mass production, simplicity, and the Soviet philosophy of warfare. Quantity and shock over precision. The Katyusha didn't just change World War II, it changed warfare itself, establishing the multiple rocket launcher as a standard weapon system used by every major military to this day. The path to rockets. Rockets weren't new in 1941. They'd been used in warfare for centuries, from Chinese fire arrows to concrete rockets during the Napoleonic Wars. But rockets had largely disappeared from military arsenals by the late 19th century because artillery had become far more accurate and reliable. Rockets were wildly inaccurate, expensive, and unpredictable. Why use rockets when artillery could hit the same target more reliably? The Soviet Union, however, had a different perspective. Soviet engineers and military theorists were interested in rocket technology throughout the 1920s and 1930s. They weren't thinking about strategic missiles or space travel, though some visionaries like Konstantin Tsiolkovsky dreamed of such things. They were thinking about saturating target areas with explosive warheads quickly and cheaply. The key figure was Georgy Langmak, a brilliant engineer and military scientist who headed the Soviet Gas Dynamics Laboratory's rocket division. Langmak understood that individual rockets were inaccurate, but that didn't matter if you fired many rockets at once at area targets. Instead of trying to hit a specific tank or bunker, you'd saturate an entire area, hitting everything within it through sheer volume of fire. Langmak and his team developed solid-fuel rockets with stabilizing fins. The RS-82 and RS-132 air-to-ground rockets for aircraft proved effective in combat during the Spanish Civil War and against Japanese forces at Khalkhin Gol in 1939. These successes convinced Soviet military leadership that rocket weapons had potential. In 1938, development began on ground-launched versions. Tragically, Georgy Langmak was arrested during Stalin's Great Purge in 1937 and executed in 1938. He never saw his creation used in combat. The Soviet system was capable of great cruelty even toward its most talented citizens. But the work continued. Other engineers, including Andrei Kostikov and Vladimir Archimov, refined the design. By 1941, a practical weapon system had emerged. Design and development. The BM-13, the first Katyusha, was brilliantly simple. It consisted of 16 launch rails mounted on a modified ZIS-6 truck. The rails were arranged in 2 rows of 8, angled upward at adjustable elevation. The rockets, called M13, were 5.9 feet long, weighed 93 pounds, and carried a 5-pound explosive warhead. They had a maximum range of about 5.5 miles. The genius was in the simplicity. The launcher had no complicated aiming system, no sophisticated fire control. Crews used a simple sight and basic range tables. Accuracy of individual rockets wasn't important because you fired all 16 at once, saturating the target area. The rails were plain steel. The rockets used solid fuel that was stable and safe to handle. The entire system could be manufactured in relatively unsophisticated factories. The truck mounting was crucial. Unlike artillery, which had to be towed into position, set up and dug in, the Katyusha drove to a firing position, launched, and immediately drove away. The complete firing sequence, from arriving at position to rockets impacting to the truck driving away, took less than 5 minutes. This shoot and scoot capability made the Katyusha nearly impossible to counterattack with artillery. By the time German guns could range the firing position, the Katyusha was miles away.
The psychological impact was enormous and deliberately cultivated. The sound of incoming Katyusha rockets was distinctive and terrifying. The rockets didn't whistle like artillery shells, they shrieked and wailed. Dozens of rockets arriving simultaneously created a crescendo of screaming, followed by a rolling series of explosions that blanketed the target area. Survivors described it as the most terrifying experience of combat, worse than conventional artillery, because the sound and the sheer volume of explosions created helpless terror. When the Katyusha was first deployed in July 1941, security was absolute. The launchers were covered with tarps when not firing. Crews were sworn to secrecy under threat of death. Special NKVD units guarded the batteries. If a launcher was at risk of capture, it was to be destroyed completely. The Soviets were determined to prevent German intelligence from learning about the weapon, or worse, capturing an intact system. The first combat use, at Orsha, achieved complete surprise. German troops had no idea what hit them. Intelligence reports described a mysterious new weapon of terrifying power. German propaganda tried to dismiss it as exaggerated Soviet claims, but soldiers in the field knew better. They'd experienced it and desperately wanted answers on how to defend against it. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass use. Katyusha batteries of 4 launchers, 64 rockets total, would fire simultaneously at divisional headquarters, supply depots, troop concentrations, or artillery positions. The effect was devastating both physically and psychologically. German officers reported that their troops would break and run when Katyusha attacks began, even veterans who'd endured heavy artillery fire. The Katyusha proved especially effective during the Battle of Moscow in winter 1941-42. Soviet forces used masked Katyusha strikes to disrupt German positions before counterattacks. The psychological impact on German soldiers already suffering from cold and supply shortages was significant. The sound of Stalin's organ became associated with Soviet offensives and German retreat. Evolution and variants. The basic BM-13 was followed by improved versions. The BM-13N, introduced in 1943, used the more reliable Studebaker US-6 truck provided through Lend-Lease. American trucks were more reliable than Soviet vehicles, reducing maintenance problems. The BM-3112, mounting 12 larger M31 rockets with bigger warheads and longer range, provided heavier firepower. The M31 rocket carried a 62-pound warhead and had a range of 2.5 miles. The Soviets also developed lighter versions. The BM-8 fired smaller 82mm rockets, 24 or 36 per launcher, depending on the mounting. These provided faster saturation of closer targets. Rail-mounted versions were developed for railway troops. Armored versions were mounted on tank chassis for use by assault gun units. Even small launch frames were designed for infantry use, turning the rocket into a primitive artillery piece for small units without vehicle support. The versatility of the system was remarkable. The same basic rocket could be launched from trucks, tractors, boats, railroad cars, or simple ground frames. This flexibility meant Katyushas could be deployed wherever needed with whatever vehicles were available. During desperate moments, rockets were even fired from improvised launchers constructed in besieged cities. Production ramped up dramatically. By 1942, Soviet factories were producing thousands of launchers and millions of rockets. The Katyusha was cheap to manufacture compared to conventional artillery. The solid-fuel rockets required no sophisticated machining. The launch rails were simple steel construction. Even relatively unskilled labor could assemble them. This made the Katyusha ideal for Soviet mass production capabilities. Stalingrad and Kursk, turning the tide. At Stalingrad, Katyusha batteries supported Soviet troops fighting in the city and later encircling the German Sixth Army. The weapon's ability to saturate large areas with fire proved ideal for urban combat and for breaking up German relief attempts. Soviet gunners could fire into German positions without risking Soviet troops with conventional artillery's slower rate of fire. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, saw massive Katyusha employment. Soviet intelligence knew the German attack was coming. Katyusha batteries were positioned to fire on German assembly areas and breakthrough points. When the German offensive began, it was met with unprecedented artillery and rocket fire. Waves of Katyusha struck German tank formations, supply columns, and infantry positions throughout the battle. German accounts describe the Katyusha fire at Kursk as the most intense artillery experience of the war. The combination of conventional artillery and massed rocket attacks created a wall of fire that disrupted German coordination and inflicted heavy casualties. While the Katyusha didn't stop the attack alone, it contributed significantly to blunting the offensive and enabling Soviet counterattacks that marked the final turning point on the Eastern Front. From Kursk onward, the Red Army possessed initiative and growing numerical superiority. The Katyusha became standard equipment for Soviet artillery units. Every major offensive featured massed Katyusha strikes preparing the attack. The weapon became synonymous with Soviet military power, featured prominently in propaganda alongside T-34 tanks and other Soviet weapons.
The drive to Berlin. From 1944 to 1945, as Soviet forces drove westward toward Germany, Katyushas provided crucial fire support. The liberation of Soviet territory, the occupation of Eastern Europe, and finally the assault on Germany itself were all supported by these rocket launchers. Soviet tactics emphasized overwhelming firepower, and the Katyusha was central to this doctrine. The Battle of Berlin in April-May 1945 saw intensive Katyusha use. Soviet forces ringed the city and poured rocket fire into German defensive positions. The psychological impact on German defenders, many of them young boys and old men of the Volksstern militia, was devastating. The scream of incoming rockets and the massive explosions broke resistance before Soviet infantry even attacked. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, overall commander of Soviet forces at Berlin, was a strong advocate of the Katyusha. He understood both its material effectiveness and its psychological impact. His orders emphasized using Katyushas to soften German positions and break morale before committing Soviet infantry. This tactic saved Soviet lives while leveraging Soviet advantages in artillery and rocket systems.
The human element. Katyusha crews developed fierce pride in their weapon. Unlike artillery crews who served massive guns requiring teams to operate, Katyusha crews operated relatively small units with their truck and launcher. This created tight-knit teams. Veterans recall the excitement of firing, the rockets streaking away in rapid succession, the thunder of the launch, the satisfying devastation visible at the target area. However, being a Katyusha crew member was dangerous. German forces prioritized destroying Katyusha launchers whenever possible. Counter-battery fire would rain down on launch sites minutes after firing. If the crew hadn't relocated quickly enough, they'd be caught in the counterattack. Many crews died in their trucks, caught by German artillery before they could escape. The loading process was back-breaking work. Each M13 rocket weighed 93 pounds. Loading 16 rockets onto the launcher required hauling nearly 1,500 pounds of rockets and manhandling each one onto the rails. Crews became expert at rapid reloading, but it was exhausting physical labor. In winter, frozen fingers made the work even harder. In summer, heat and dust added to the misery. Comparing to other systems. The Germans developed their own rocket artillery, the Nebelwerfer. While effective, German rocket systems were less mobile and produced in smaller quantities. German doctrine emphasized precision artillery over saturation fire, a fundamental philosophical difference. The Nebelwerfer used towed launchers that couldn't relocate as quickly as truck-mounted Katyushas. The Western Allies were slower to adopt multiple rocket launchers. The Americans eventually deployed the T-34 Calliope, rockets mounted on Sherman tanks, but in limited numbers. British forces used land mattress launchers, primarily in support of amphibious operations. Neither Western power embraced the concept as thoroughly as the Soviets, reflecting different military doctrines and industrial capabilities. The Soviet approach, emphasizing mass production of relatively crude but effective weapons, proved ideal for their circumstances. With huge armies fighting across enormous fronts, the Soviets needed weapons that could be produced quickly, operated by minimally trained crews, and employed en masse. The Katyusha met all these requirements perfectly. Conclusion. The BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher represents Soviet military philosophy at its finest. It was crude, simple, and inaccurate, yet devastatingly effective when used properly. It combined existing technology in innovative ways to create a weapon system that changed warfare. It demonstrated that, in modern combat, overwhelming firepower delivered rapidly could be more important than precision. The Katyusha became a symbol of Soviet resistance and eventual victory. When Soviet people heard the scream of rockets launching, they knew their army was attacking, pushing the invaders back, advancing toward Berlin. When German soldiers heard Stalin's organ, they knew death was coming, unavoidable, unstoppable, terrifying. Over 10,000 Katyusha launchers were built during World War II. They fired millions of rockets, delivering thousands of tons of explosives onto German forces. The weapon that began as a desperate experiment became one of the war's most effective systems. Today, descendants of the Katyusha serve in armies worldwide. The basic concept proven in 1941 remains valid. When you need to saturate an area quickly with fire, when you need to shock and terrify the enemy, when you need mobile firepower that can strike and disappear, the multiple rocket launcher is the answer. The Katyusha showed the way, and Stalin's organ still echoes across battlefields 80 years later.